From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, how to sit back, relax, and unwind in front of yet another new celebrity cooking show. And now, the podcast host who has no use for cooking shows because cooking and preparing food is hard, Pete Dominick!
Absolutely nailed it, my friend, which is why I'm so excited and jealous that my daughter is going to go off to college next year and eat in a dining hall. Oh, that was the best. I could have done that the rest of my life. Yeah, I do not like preparing food. I don't like cleaning up after myself. There's nothing better than the dining hall experience. And, of course, I think it's the same as going to restaurants, isn't it? Anyway, hello, welcome to the Wednesday show. Is it already Wednesday here? It's April 12th, and I'm very happy to have you joining me for another great conversation with Tim Wise, who's an anti-racist writer and speaker. You know and love Tim Wise. What you might not have known is that Tim lives with his family in Tennessee, not far from where that horrific shooting was a few weeks ago. And so, of course, he's locked and loaded to say everything about what's going on in Tennessee politics, in anti-racism or racism, as the Republicans in the state house have not been very open-minded. Let's just say that. Lots of good stuff to talk about with Tim on today's show. I think you're really going to like that. If you want to jump right ahead to that conversation, Tim and I start at about 15, 16 minutes into today's show. But I do want to mention a few news stories here at the top. I try to do that Monday through Thursday. I've been slacking a little bit because I've had plenty of other stuff going on, but getting back to it today, and certainly lots to talk about. And sorry about the technical issue in the last 10 minutes of my conversation yesterday with Eric Siegel, where there was something, our voices were overlapping. I did something wrong in my edit. And I heard from lots of listeners about that. I really appreciate it when anybody reaches out in any number of ways. People are posting about it in the Discord channel that we have for paid subscribers. I got texts, I got emails, I got comments on the Patreon post, and it's all welcome. If you ever have a problem with the show, and if you tell me that there is a problem, let me know. And then I usually fix it, and then I put it back up. I re-upload it. The problem is your phone, your computer, whatever, your car, whatever it is, has downloaded the error version and not catching me re-uploading. So you can always go to standupwithpete.com, but specifically standupwithpete.libsyn.com. I'll put that link very top of every show notes. It's in there, standupwithpete.libsyn.com, and that is the most accurate version. If I edit the show, fix the problems, and put it back up, and you go press play there, that should solve all your problems. Also, if for some reason your pod player isn't playing it, you go to the host site for my podcast and others as well, and that should let you know if it's there. I mean, a couple weeks ago, I posted a show with no audio. Oh, that was agonizing. All right, well, there you go. That's the advice, and sorry for the error. I beat my fake producer and threw him in the woods, and he came crawling back with nothing but apologies. And he stepped on a mousetrap, so that's what you get for that kind of mess up. And now it's time for yesterday's news. Well, you probably heard about the whole dust-up between the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and the Representative Jim Jordan, spelled with a G, of Ohio. The Manhattan District Attorney now is suing Jim Jordan, accusing him of interference in the Trump case. So he's not lying down for Jim Jordan because he's afraid that he could get touched inappropriately and then Jim Jordan will look the other way. I think that's an interesting story. It's certainly worth mentioning. Also, how about this? Chicago, you're going to be hosting the Democratic National Convention in 2024. So one lucky Chicago-based family will allow me to sleep on their couch, guest room, or in their driveway in the trunk of their car. I just need a free place to stay because I'm coming. Chicago next summer, the largest liberal city in the heart of the Midwest, a key battleground region. That's where the DNC will be, and that's where Pete Dominick plans to be as well. We'll see. Let me know who wants to have me. The leaked Pentagon documents are really BFD. I'm catching up with this story now. Some of you, I know, have been talking about it. This is a really important story that is maybe not getting enough attention for any number of reasons, but let me read from Politico. Breach of trust. The Pentagon, already nervous and angry after a trust-shattering tranche of highly classified images and documents spread online last week, is waiting to see if that leak is just the beginning. Some officials view the still unfolding saga as perhaps even more damaging than the Edward Snowden famous leak of classified intelligence a decade ago, because of how recent and relevant the information is. And it remains unclear whether the Defense Department is anywhere near finding the source of the leak or ascertaining whether the leaker will drop more material in the coming days. The Justice Department opened a criminal inquiry. You decide. I think I said it the same both times. Anyway, they opened this inquiry into the breach of over 100 documents Sunday evening, including information on Ukraine's fight against Russia, as well as Turkish cooperation with Israel and U.S. efforts to spy on South Korea. And apparently the South Koreans are pretty pissed. They accuse the U.S. of violating its sovereignty after highly classified leaked documents suggest the Americans have been spying on South Korea's top national security officials. And in addition to potentially damaging Ukraine's planned counteroffensive this spring, the leak has also embittered U.S. allies who are reportedly still waiting on substantive answers from Washington in response to requests for a briefing. So, very big deal about the leaked Pentagon documents and the strain it's putting on relationships with our good friends. Hey, sorry you guys found out that we're spying on you, but you knew we were spying on you, right? Because everything's like the Roy family in Succession. That's right. I'm watching season 3. Don't say anything. No spoilers. The Louisville gunman, as I'll call him, is a 25-year-old man. He legally purchased the rifle he used to kill his coworkers. I said he's dead. And apparently he wanted to kill himself. The gunman told at least one person he was suicidal before the rampage. But yeah, he bought the AR-15 style rifle, as always, he used from a local dealership just last week. 4 victims remaining hospitalized as of yesterday afternoon. 2 of those, one a 26-year-old officer who recently graduated from the police academy and was working just his 4th shift on the job, were in critical condition. And here is the mayor of Louisville. His name is Craig Greenberg. He addressed the press yesterday, and just one segment, one part of it, one point that he made that I thought was interesting and important, discussing the latest mass shooting in the U.S., which killed 5 people at a bank in his city.
The second thing, and to those in the national media that are joining us here today, this may be even more shocking than it is to those of us locally who know this and are dealing with this. But under current Kentucky law, the assault rifle that was used to murder 5 of our neighbors and shoot at rescuing police officers will one day be auctioned off. Think about that. That murder weapon will be back on the streets one day under Kentucky's current law. My administration has already taken action to remove the firing pin before turning confiscated guns over to the state, because that's all that the current law allows us to do. That's not enough. It's time to change this law and let us destroy illegal guns and destroy the guns that have been used to kill our friends and kill our neighbors.
All right, that is the mayor of Louisville on fire yesterday. Like that a lot. Interesting point, an issue. I didn't know anything about that. All right, moving on from the horrible gun violence issue, which we could do hours on every day, unfortunately. I wanted to mention this. I thought this was interesting. It's about a 2.5-minute clip from CNN chief legal analyst Elie Honig. He was on with Jake Tapper yesterday, and Tapper asked Elie Honig about the Dominion lawsuits prospects, and I thought this was a pretty interesting analysis from Elie Honig, and I don't know why it was so hard for me to get that word out, but either way, here it is for you to listen to now.
Elie, we've already seen so many of these damaging texts and emails from Fox executives and hosts in the case in which they acknowledge that the nonsense they were putting on their air and putting guests on their air sharing, they knew to be false. If you were a Fox attorney defending Fox, how would you feel going into jury selection this week about your case?
I'd feel queasy, Jake. I would not want to be in the position of defending Fox here. I think they're headed for a full-blown journalistic and legal disaster. It is very difficult to successfully sue a media outlet for defamation in this country. What you have to prove is what we call actual malice, meaning the statements were false and the defendant made those statements knowingly or with reckless disregard of the truth. Now, that's a very high bar, but here we have Fox's own texts in black and white where they call the election fraud claims, and I quote, nuts, insane, BS. And so you contrast that with the things that Fox said on air, and I think Fox is in a very difficult position here. Now, the judge granted partial summary judgment to Dominion in this case. What does that mean? How significant is it? Well, that's a big win for Dominion because the judge has now ruled as a matter of law and fact, these statements about election fraud were false. That's not even going to the jury. So the judge will tell the jury, I instruct you, jury, these statements were false. Your only job is to decide that actual malice question. Did Fox know or were they reckless? And so with that ruling, Dominion's really halfway to where they need to get. Are we going to hear, do you think, from some of the high profile names in the case, whether it's Rupert Murdoch or Sean Hannity? Absolutely. Rupert Murdoch, the judge ruled, has to testify. Sean Hannity is on both sides witness list. Maria Bartiromo and others are very likely witnesses. And Jake, when someone's a news anchor, they're sort of used to asking the questions and to dictating what the topics will be. Let me tell you, the tables are going to be turned when those folks are sitting in the witness box. It will not be up to them when the questioning is over. It will not be up to them what the topic will be. They're going to be at the mercy of the judge and the lawyers. Bill Barr, the former attorney general, who's been pretty clear about these lies being lies, he wrote an op-ed saying that he did not think that this would be a good decision for journalism writ large if Dominion wins. I don't know if you read his case, but you've heard the First Amendment arguments. What do you think of them? I disagree. I think that the First Amendment needs to be very broad. It should be broad. We in the media take advantage of the First Amendment as we should. It's part of our system, but it's not limitless. And if, as the allegation is here, any outlet or any person lies knowing that it is false, then yes, there can be civil consequences. So I disagree with Attorney General Barr on that.
Man, I thought that was a great rapid fire back and forth on CNN between Jake Tapper and Elie Honig. Great analysis there. And I thought an awesome point what Elie Honig said about all these right-wing talkers. They're normally in control of the conversation. This is something I've always said for the history of talk radio and what I did not want to do and don't want to be. And that's what they are. They control, they curate an idea. They never let you make the argument and compete in the arena of thought that one would at least begin to require to have a nuanced understanding of challenging issues. That is not what this is going to be. They are going to be put on the spot and have to answer questions. So I thought that was a really good point by Elie Honig. I hope we get to see those tapes. I doubt we will. But Hannity and Tucker under questioning, ooh, that I would definitely pay to watch. All right, what else did I want to mention? Just a couple other quick hits. More than 2,000 residents are under an evacuation order after a large fire broke out Tuesday afternoon at an Indiana recycling plant. That sucks if you live near that area. The Biden administration formally ended the COVID-19 national emergency, and the International Monetary Fund downgraded forecasts for the global economy. The FBI is warning the public against using charging stations in malls and at airports, according to a tweet from the bureau in the Denver office. Apparently, the public charging stations could be a conduit for bad actors to introduce malware onto personal devices, according to officials. Well, that sucks. I like using those free charging stations, especially at airports. Well, I guess you're just going to have to have a good, trusty, handy-dandy portable battery to charge up your phone, because you don't want any malware or monitoring software on your phone. Would you take the risk, though? If your phone's about to die and you're at an airport, you're going to be like, fuck it, I'm plugging this in. I'll risk the malware because I've got to have a full battery before I get on the plane. You will. I bet you would. I think I probably would. All right, well, that is all the news that I've got for you on today's segment. I will try to do this Monday through Thursday. Just mention a few stories here at the top because I'm paying attention all day. And if you want to skip ahead because it's depressing or you don't like it, I'll always try to give you that option at the top too. And now it's time to get to my conversation with Tim Wise. But remember, I can't have these conversations Monday through Friday and sometimes more without your support. and you can be a part of our community. Every Thursday night we hang out. There's a Discord platform that people are chatting in all the time. I was in there yesterday and realized how much more I need to be in there. There's so many awesome different conversations going on the Discord platform. If you don't know what that is and you want help to be involved, email me and I'll hook you up with listeners who can help you. standupwithpete@gmail.com and join us. Sign up, patreon.com/Pete Dominic. All right, well, you know Tim Wise. Do I even really need to give him an introduction? He's an anti-racist writer and speaker. He is one of our all-time favorite guests. People love when Tim joins the show. He's written 9 books, including his latest, Dispatches from the Race War. Go to timjwise.medium.com to read his latest. We talked about a couple of those recent posts. And, of course, he's still awesome on Twitter. He's not quitting, and I'm glad he's not, because I go check out his feed every other day or so, and I just love his tweets on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. Tim's very first response cuts out just a tiny bit, and I think that's really the only noticeable audio issue, but you'll be sure to tell me otherwise. So let's do it right now with the great Tim Wise.
And we are off with one of my all-time favorite people to talk to, read, listen to, Tim Wise. And thank you very much for joining me, Tim. A lot to talk about, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here. I feel like I am to you what certain people are to like Howard Stern. You just have me on over and over again, and I get to just pontificate and run my mouth. It's like a segment. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on and do that.
Yes, you broke up a tiny second there, so hopefully it'll stop. But yes, absolutely. People say to me, I saw Tim Wise was going to be on. I always press play when Tim Wise is on. He doesn't ever say anything that isn't awesome. Stuff like that. Those are the kinds. I love those comments from listeners because I've always felt the same way. Of course, I reached out to you privately as soon as that shooting happened because, not as soon as. I didn't even put it together until maybe a week. I saw one of your tweets. I was like, oh, shit, Tim lives in Tennessee. So, just take me back to that day when in this school and tell me about, that area or anything you want to say is, just first and foremost, someone living there.
Yeah. Well, this shooting happened at a school that is a mile and a quarter from the apartments that I grew up in and spent the first 18 years of my life in, a mile and a quarter, mile and a half from where I went to high school, a mile and a quarter in the other direction from where I went to elementary school. So I was a 9-year-old kid in a school very close to where that one was many, many years ago. It's up on a hill that I had to pass every time I went to my grandparents' house. It's, up the hill from the Bluebird Cafe, the famous writers' room and songwriters and musicians hang out in Nashville that a lot of tourists know very well. And so it was really something that happened in the backyard of my youth. And even, come to find out that we do have some sort of second degree connections to some of the people who were affected directly by this horrible incident. So it hit very close to home, and they all do. And I've lost a friend to gun violence when I was 11. So it's not like I'm a stranger to this, but it was something that I think was just so over the top and horrific, even by the standards of these things. This is in that Sandy Hook category. And it's not because the victims were younger necessarily. It's just the entire sort of panoply of what happened, the horror of what happened, the fact that we do have video of the police charging through the school and ultimately, shooting the killer in this instance just makes it so incredibly visceral, I think, for everyone, but especially for those of us who were here in Nashville. So it was a lot. And what made it a lot even more than the act itself was the really horrific way in which certain forces in our state and around the country responded. I mean, Obviously there was the outpouring of grief and emotion, and that was pretty universal across the political spectrum. But then, of course, you had the typical sort of thoughts and prayers. If we just prayed more and thought more and loved the Lord more, maybe this wouldn't happen. Well, this is a Christian school. I mean, I think they talk about Jesus at the Covenant School. This isn't just a Christian school. It's a conservative school connected to the Presbyterian Church of America, which of the two large Presbyterian institutions is the conservative, even neo-reactionary ones.
So you're saying that even with such a religious institution, with a massive, like a real serious concentration of thoughts and prayers, those thoughts and prayers could not protect those children's lives. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Of course not. And because prayers, if prayer is the answer to this thing, God is clearly mocking us because people have been praying a lot. And this stuff just keeps happening. There's a lot of, Christians actually die. I don't know if Christians know this, but they do in fact die, and they pray all the time. So the idea that that's an answer is obviously preposterous in general, and it was ridiculous here. And so that's what we had. On the one hand, we had thoughts and prayers. And then, of course, you had this gaggle of fools, both locally and nationally, who decided that once they found out the shooter was apparently trans, and again, I don't really know to what extent that was a fully developed identity for this shooter, or whether, I don't know, non-binary or trans or what the case might be. But once that was known, right, then all bets were off. Oh, well, it's because they're trans. Well, there is no criminologist, no scientist of any kind or social scientist who could explain why being trans is uniquely connected to acting violent. There is no such connection. The overwhelming majority of these kinds of crimes, of course, the 99.5% have been committed by people that, as far as we know, are cisgender and overwhelmingly straight. That doesn't mean there's something about being straight and cisgender that makes you a mass murderer, right? It just means this has nothing to do with that.
No, and that's always worth mentioning, the mentally ill, and specifically if you want to, and I'm not equating mentally ill to trans people, but I'm saying they're both categories of people. Are far more likely to be victims of violence because we're scared of the mentally ill, and we're saying that that's what's wrong with them necessarily. And we're scared now of trans people, and we're saying that's what's wrong with them. The truth is you're far more likely to be a victim of crime. Or in trans, what you hear so much is self-harming and even suicide. So the idea that we're going to say that they're dangerous to others is really disappointing, sad, and dangerous.
Yeah, let's be very clear that someone who has gender dysphoria, if in fact they have that particular, I don't know if the right word is condition or what it's diagnosed as, right? Let's say this individual was gender dysphoric. I don't know. Even if you want to call that a mental illness, and I'm not classifying it as such, and the DSM the DSM doesn't say that being trans makes you mentally ill. So it's not considered mental illness in the sense that we normally think of that. But even if you're someone who wants to consider it some type of mental illness, it's not one of those quote unquote conditions that's connected to violence. You could argue that being untreated schizophrenic does have some connection to either self-harm or potentially acting out in ways that are aggressive. That's not untrue, even though your point is still well taken that the mentally ill are more likely to be victims than they are to be perps. That's true of pretty much every group. We have to be careful when we use that as the argument, because just about any demographic you choose is more likely to be victim than perp. They're more victims.
But if you want to be, I think what I'm trying to say is if you want to be scared of a certain group of people, there are groups, if you want to go by statistically, that are more likely to be victims or perpetrators of violence against you.
Right. And trans folk are certainly not among the top groups. And the point being, even if you want to say there are certain mental illnesses that are connected potentially, if untreated, to violent aggression, borderline personality disorder, schizoaffective disorder, there may be scientific evidence for that. That's not the same as gender dysphoria, even if you thought gender dysphoria was some type of quote unquote mental illness. So if this shooter was mentally ill, that's got nothing to do with them being trans. And that, in fact, may be what they were being treated for. Apparently, this individual was in some kind of mental health treatment. However, I would love to know what kind, because what wasn't reported openly, but those of us here know a little bit about, is that this individual's mother is an employee, or at least had been an employee, at an incredibly reactionary conservative church here in Nashville that has incredibly traditional ideas about sexuality and gender. So I start to wonder if this, and this is not to excuse the horrific act of the shooter, who I'm going to refer to now using pronouns he and him, because this is apparently what the shooter preferred. I don't think that it is fair to say that this justifies what he did. But if this is someone who was being raised in an environment where he was being told, because of his struggles around gender identity and uncertainty around gender identity, or feeling that, in fact, his gender identity was something other than his presumed gender at birth, that he was sinful, that he was broken, that he was wrong, that he was awful, that he was violating God's will, which is certainly something that could have happened in that home and at that church and at that school, which this adult now, attended when they were a kid, then it's very possible that the thing that led to the shame and the rage, yes, or at least contributed to the shame and the rage, was the way they were treated. It wasn't that they were trans. It wasn't that he was trans. It is that he was marginalized and harassed and made to feel like crap because he was trans.
Yeah, you could see this.
But it's a far better explanation than, oh, he was trans, right? Neither one
exactly,
may be relevant,
yes. So well said. A far better explanation. A far better explanation. I mean, the idea that you would take a child who says that they're gay at one of these schools and put them in a conversion therapy program. Now what you're doing is you're saying to that child, you are broken and we will fix you. But the truth is they aren't broken, and that won't fix them. That will break them even further, potentially, most likely. And that is what we're talking about here. That's why you're mentioning the root of these problems, and we don't quite know. And the situation can often be obviously not primarily just guns, but after that, it's like, what happened to that kid?
Right. Right. And the thing is, here's someone who, and we do have a little bit more information coming out now that suggests that there were some longstanding emotional issues with this person going back even to middle school that didn't have anything to do with sex, gender identity, any of that stuff, just other things going on. And we may never know entirely. But what's fascinating is that when the right started first, they start in on the trans thing because that fulfills this aspect of their political agenda. And then they, of course, did the other thing they do when they don't want to talk about guns, which is talk about mental health. Right. But as I wrote a piece yesterday on Medium, put out a piece yesterday that I think speaks to that, because whenever they say that, my first reaction is, well, then what is your mental health plan? What is your mental health public policy that you support? Because every time they say that, they never actually tell you what they want to do about mental health. Do they want to, because every liberal I know, every progressive I know, and the vast majority of just big D Democrats that I know would agree we ought to do something about mental health in this country. We ought to have better mental health funding, universal health care, both physical health and mental health. They both ought to be covered under universal care and affordable care. We ought to guarantee that people have access to that. Believe me, I pay a lot for therapy. I would really, love to be able to get mental and emotional health care.
Yes, but they won't. What your piece, this is a great piece. Everybody has to read it. And what you say, and you'll say it smarter, but basically is a horrible gun violence happens. Democrats and Republicans say we have to do something. Democrats say we got to do something with the guns. Republicans say no, we got to do something with mental health. And Democrats say, okay, we'll do something with mental health. We'll do your idea, which we agree with. It's our idea too. Let's do it. And then they say, we're not going to pay for it. You write this right here in your piece. You talk about the Mental Health Matters Act introduced to Congress last year, passed by the House, only to die in the Senate. At least for now. The bill sought to provide substantial new mental and emotional health care resources, especially to young people who need them. It called for evaluating best practices for delivering such care to children and youth and ensuring access to such services in schools where they could be provided to all kids. And you say it sought to provide trauma-informed care for young people impacted by various adverse childhood experiences and to ensure that counselors are appropriately trained in providing such health care. And all but one Republican in the House voted against it, is what you write at Medium.
Right. And it's not like they said, well, we don't like your plan. Here's our alternative plan. Because I get it. Like, I get that Republicans may not want to sign on to a Democrat bill, whatever, then propose your own or propose a bunch of great amendments. They didn't do any of that. They were just like, no, screw this. So it leads me to believe that when they talk about mental health, for some, it's just a deflection, right? It's a way not to talk about guns. But for others, I think they do have a plan. They just don't want to admit what it is. For them, dealing with mental health means sending you to Jesus camp. Right. Having you talk to a preacher, a minister, a pastor, a priest.
Right. If that's why you are the way you are, is because there's no God in your home and in your life. Right, that's exactly the problem.
If you're gay or lesbian, bisexual, trans, we'll send you to a conversion therapy kind of camp. And if it's some other kind of mental illness, and I'm putting mental illness in quotes because I don't think those things are. But if that's what you think, The other types, they just want to take those folks and lock them away, right? Because think about how they talk about homeless folks, right? There is a significant number of people who are unhoused, who are on the streets, who have undiagnosed or in some cases diagnosed mental and emotional issues. No question about that. But what is their solution? Do they want to ensure services? No, they talk, let's just sweep the streets. Let's lock these people up. If they had their way, they would involuntarily institutionalize them. So basically their answer is Jesus and rubber rooms. Right? Jesus and straitjackets, Jesus and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jesus and Girl Interrupted. That is their plan, right? That's what they want to do, is just lock people away, dope them up with Thorazine, and leave them in a corner to bang their head against the wall. They don't care about mental illness, just like they don't care about children getting slaughtered in schools, because if they did, they would do something. And yet instead, in this state, what happens is you get a guy who's a representative of the people in the House of Representatives here, a Republican who goes up to a bunch of kids who asked him what he was going to do about guns. And his only answer is, well, what gun would you prefer to be killed with? What gun would you prefer to be shot with? I mean, it's not just the AR-15 you could be killed with. What kind of question is that? That's what you respond to children with. You're basically saying there's nothing we can do, and all guns can kill you. Yes, but not all guns can shoot 150 bullets in the course of a couple of minutes and expand and explode the back as it blows you out from the front when you get shot with it, right? I'd rather there's a thing called statistical odds, and you are far more likely to die when you get shot by an AR-15 than when you get shot by anything else. So the fact that we can't do anything about that in these guys' mind, or won't do anything about that. But we'll talk about trans folk. We'll talk about drag shows. We'll talk about LGBTQ folks. We'll talk about critical race theory. We'll talk about social and emotional learning, which is the other reason they don't want to do mental health in schools. Because what if that becomes, social and emotional learning? Yeah, that's a gateway drug to critical race theory. That's a gateway drug to wokeness. There was, I mentioned in the piece, there was Connecticut had passed a law last year that would expand the availability of mental health professionals in high schools throughout the state of Connecticut. And it passed overwhelmingly. But then people in this town, Killingly, I think is the name of it, a small sort of blue collar conservative town. The parents got up in arms because, mental health is, modern psychology is a cult. It's part of the occultism of Sigmund Freud, who used drugs, and Carl Jung, who used to summon spirits. I don't know why I'm doing a semi-Southern accent for Connecticut people. It's just my default, but like that's what they're saying. They're saying they're going to get in our children's heads. My kid, this one guy said, my teenager, had a therapist trying to twist his brain all around, and so they didn't want therapists because they might talk to him about sex. They might talk to him about gender identity. Might talk to him about, all kinds of serious things that maybe the kid doesn't think they can talk to their parents about. The parents want authority so much that they'll sacrifice their children's well-being for it. It's astounding.
Yeah, you linked to the New York Times piece about this news. A mental health clinic in school? No thanks, says the school board. American teenagers reporting severe levels of anxiety and depression. But when Connecticut moved to expand mental health services in schools, it ran into fierce opposition in one town. I had no idea about that. Of course, you know all about my town, but we haven't gone as far as becoming anti-mental health clinic, or yet, although I do hear people starting to bark about social and emotional learning like that's a bad thing. It's like the point being, no matter what we try to do to address mental health issues, we're not allowed to do it. And we're certainly not allowed to do anything about the guns. Well, let me ask you then, staying in Tennessee, the Republicans kicked out, they censored 3 people, kicked out 2 of them. 2 of them are black. Those 2 guys who are community organizers are very popular, ended up raising a whole bunch of money, and then they got restored back into the legislature. So the Republicans in your state that apparently run the state kicked the ball right into their own goal. Then they took the ball out, and then they kicked it back into their own goal, and then they shot themselves in the foot and dropped an anvil on the speaker. What a horrific political move. What is going on with these Republicans, and what has been the reaction by anti-racists in your state?
I just want to thank the Tennessee Republican Party and the Tennessee Republican House delegation for giving progressives in this state, and I think throughout the South in particular, and other quote unquote red states where we have been on the margins for so long, for giving us this incredible gift of reminding us who you are and what you stand for, because what they did was they created national celebrities in particular out of Justin Pearson and Justin Jones, both of whom deserved to be that and deserved it even before this. But now they have this spotlight and they are demonstrating through their brilliance as activists, as organizers, as tacticians, because this was tactical. They didn't do this on a whim. They understood the optics of this. They were in a chamber where a bunch of teenagers who organized that rally. This was organized by high school students. And what Pearson and Jones and Gloria Johnson out of Knoxville did was they understood the moment. And they channeled the power and the energy of those young people in the well of that house and demonstrated in solidarity with them, knowing full well that they were probably going to be censured. I don't think they expected to be expelled because that was so over the top, such an incredibly overwrought reaction. But they knew there would be consequences.
There were criminals that they never expelled.
What's that?
There were Republicans who were criminals that weren't expelled.
Child molesters, people that peed in chairs of their colleagues, people that, wrote illegal prescriptions to, as Gloria Johnson mentioned on her Twitter, their cousin mistress with a hyphen in between, which is a great new category of cousin and mistress all at once. They didn't kick out any of those people. No, they have a history of not kicking people out, even for criminal wrongdoing. And their reason that they've given in the past for not doing so was they didn't want to override the will of the voters. But in this case, well, who are Justin Jones and Justin Pearson's voters?
You wrote on Twitter, Tennessee Republicans, there is no systemic racism. Also, Tennessee Republicans, now, hold our Klan robes. We have to expel these two loud black people. We just have to have a little chat with the white lady on the side. But first and foremost, no racism. Goodbye to the black legislators who are also well-known community organizers.
Right. I performed a little extra. Our avatars for a Gen Z and sort of younger millennial group of people who are better organizers than we were years ago and even are now. And they are showing us all the way to do this. Yeah. And I think so. When I say I want to thank the Tennessee GOP, I'm quite serious. This is not going to be a disaster for progressivism. You're going to see organizations in Nashville and Memphis in particular, and I think around the South, that are going to be invigorated by the influx, not only of money, but of organizers. I've been calling for, and I have no authority to do this, so I'm not officially calling for it, but I'm only half joking when I say it. And I hope that some of the organizations in the state will think seriously about it. What we need is not what some are calling for, which is a boycott of Tennessee. Don't go to Tennessee. Don't travel to Nashville. Don't go to Memphis. No. We need all y'all to come. We need all the progressives to come, to flood the state, to join up with some of these groups like the Equity Alliance here in Nashville, led by these amazing black women who are some of the most brilliant organizers that I've ever seen, or Stand Up Nashville, or some of there are similar groups in doing amazing work around criminal justice reform in Memphis. There are amazing organizations, and I mentioned some of them in a piece I wrote for Medium a couple days ago. About that. We need folks to come, connect, volunteer, go out and do voter registration with some of these groups, go out and organize with some of these groups. In 1964, the civil rights movement didn't say boycott Mississippi. That wasn't their message. Mississippi was the fulcrum of white supremacy. They didn't say, don't go to Jackson. Don't go to Oxford. Right. Don't go to Hattiesburg. Don't go to Greenville. Oh, no. They said, y'all need to come to all of those places and you need to organize. And they did Freedom Summer 64. They did voter registration. They set up freedom schools. They learned organizing tactics from one another. That's what we need in Tennessee. We need a Freedom Summer, a Freedom Fall, a Freedom Winter, a Freedom Spring. We need progressives to come, because I tell you what, if progressives boycott, the MAGA tourists are still going to come, man. They're going to come to go to Kid Rock's stupid ass steakhouse down on Lower Broadway.
Ew.
They're going to come. And in fact, the Republican Party would be happy to invite him in and say, oh, good. We have less progressives coming, less liberals coming, less LGBTQ friendly folks coming, or conventions that are progressive. Good. We'll just get the NRA convention. We'll just get the Religious Broadcasters Association convention. We'll just get the Turning Point USA convention. We'll just get all of those folks. I don't want to cede the ground to those people, particularly in a moment like this, right, when you've got some incredible progressive organizers who need the infusion, not just of money, but of bodies and of talent coming here and working side by side with them and contributing to their efforts.
How bad do you think they're overplaying their hand, Republicans, both at the state and national level, when it comes to abortion, no restrictions, no abortions, including rape and incest? Now they are trying to get rid of the abortion pill. They might even successfully, if that federal judge has its way. Now you see what they're doing with guns, what they've always been doing, all of this really. But when you look at the political scene, whether it be in Tennessee, where they've overplayed their hand, or nationwide? How do you think it's looking for them?
I think that they have jumped the shark on any number of issues, and I think they're going to pay the price for it. These are people who believe their own hype. They spend so much time in their little suburban and ex-urban, evangelical Christian spaces that they think everybody thinks like them.
Right.
And if you think I'm smart enough, look, I've been all over the country. I've spoken in every state. I know damn good and well not everybody thinks like I do. I'm very clear on that. So I know that I can't get my way without a lot more work. I'm going to have to do a lot more persuading and a lot more talking and a lot more writing. And I'm nowhere near, in my views, representing the vast majority of Americans. In some areas, probably the majority, but in some areas, I know that's not true. These are people who fundamentally, everybody they know thinks like them. And as a result, they don't realize that the vast majority of folks don't believe in eliminating women's bodily autonomy. And the vast majority of folks don't believe that we need to ban drag performance as the biggest threat to children while we allow weapons of war to slice them up in an elementary school. Most people don't agree with their views on banning books in libraries that they don't like, or defunding.
Right. Another example of them overplaying, where they're banning these books, and then they restored the books in Texas, and now they're like, well, then we're going to ban the library. People don't like that. Right. Conservatives don't like that. They know that means they don't get access to Ayn Rand.
Of course, right, exactly. I mean, this is what they don't get, is that the Covenant School shooting, and if you had told me 2 weeks before that there was going to be, any kind of upsurge in progressive activism or pro-democracy organizing, I would have said, God, I hope you're right, but I don't know. Right. But what that shooting did, and God knows, at the very least, if we're going to have a tragedy like that, we got to make something out of it, or otherwise it's just tragedy. We have to. I'm not saying exploit it. I'm saying if it happened, you might as well do something. And the reality is that incident, because it was a private Christian school, because these were affluent folks, because this was in Green Hills, which is an affluent part of Nashville, and you have people who otherwise, let's be honest, if this had happened in a public school, particularly in an urban area, if it had happened in even in a rural area, it just wouldn't have gotten the same attention. But now you've got, soccer moms and dads, hockey moms and dads. You got these suburban folks who are not overtly progressive. They're definitely not left wing by any stretch of the imagination. They wouldn't call themselves quote unquote woke. And yet they realize they have a commonality of interest with the folks that Justin Jones and Justin Pearson have been representing, who have been dealing with gun violence, dealing with issues of inequality and injustice for generations. And so now what the right is doing is they're creating a recognition of common interest among people who maybe didn't know that they had common interest. Because what do all these things have in common? Opposition to gun control, the desire to restrict women's reproductive freedom, the desire to ban books, the desire to ban drag performance. They're all anti-democratic. I don't mean big D. I mean small d. They're anti-democracy. They are authoritarian. They are about pushing forward legislation that the majority of people do not agree with, or resisting legislation that the majority would like to have. So when you are openly acknowledging that you are acting in an authoritarian way, then all the people you affect, which isn't just black and brown folk, and it isn't just undocumented immigrants, and it isn't just LGBTQ folk, and it isn't just, liberal feminist women. It's like the vast majority of people in your state and country, you are screwed. And so if I'm a Democrat right now trying to figure out how do we organize for 2024, how do we organize locally, state, national, I'm talking about guns, and I'm talking about democracy and the assault on democracy and the fetishizing of guns all the time. Full time, 100%, because all those other things, abortion rights and reproductive justice, the ability to learn real history in schools, the freedom to read, all of that falls under the democracy banner. And then the gun thing is sort of the umbrella above all of that, that these folks care less about the lives of your children. That's the message. Where, all this other stuff that we love to talk about. And I get it. We got to have a public policy for universal broadband. And we got to have we got to have a policy to do this, that, and the other with the Affordable Care Act. There's a healthcare angle here. What's the healthcare angle? You still got a bunch of states, Tennessee's one of them, that won't expand Medicaid. Oh, yeah. Why? Even though the majority would like to do that, they won't do it. Right? Why? Because they don't care about the health of the people. They care about exploiting cultural resentment toward this thing called Obamacare. So if they expand Medicaid, that's given in to Obama.
Well, they don't think their taxpayer money should go towards that because Medicaid is socialism, but Medicare is as American as apple pie. And it's a really important point you're saying about the healthcare point. But, you have this other great piece at Medium that ties in with some of what you're just saying, titled, "It was never about the religious liberty. Evangelical Christians want to impose their faith, not merely practice it." And you posted this for those people who celebrate Easter, I believe.
Yes,
this was an Easter post, really.
I'm going to hold it off, and then I realized, it's Easter. I should probably post this now just to really piss people off.
Well, the idea that Christian religious liberty is under attack is one that is so pervasive that it creates an authentic idea for a frighteningly large number of white Christian Americans that they are being discriminated against, that they are losing opportunity and so on, not black and brown folks who historically have. It's now they're more discriminated against because their religious liberties are under attack. This is a really great piece. What do you want to say?
Well, let's just think for a second about all the examples that they use. And I have a litany of them that I mentioned in the piece. Yeah. But, the fact that we wouldn't let Kim Davis, the county clerk in Kentucky, refrain from writing marriage licenses for same-sex couples. That was an infringement of her religion. No, she's a public employee. Her salary's paid for by taxpayers, including the gay guys she wouldn't write the certificate for. So what you're saying is that if you're a Christian, you don't have to do your job because you interpret the Bible a particular way, and you should be able to keep your job. No, that's bullshit.
That is also some real common caucasity, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. What they're saying is that if you're a Christian pharmacist, you shouldn't have to fill birth control, particularly if you think it's abortifacient, you think it's taking human life. You shouldn't. If you're a doctor, you shouldn't have to provide care to anyone whose sexual orientation or gender identity you find to be unbiblical. If whatever, they've got example after example that they've said their liberties are being restricted if you don't let them essentially opt out of the laws that the rest of us have to live by. So in other words, I can't discriminate against you for your religion, but you can use your religion to discriminate against me or whoever for whatever reason you choose under the banner of religious liberty. So it's obviously nonsense. But every now and then, as I point out in the piece, they prove what nonsense it is. And there was a story out of Texas last week, which really demonstrated the point. They, I guess, are considering a piece of legislation in Texas because they got nothing else to do in Texas. Apparently they have no problems. There's nobody lacking health care. There's nobody that needs more education funding. There's no infrastructure that needs to be repaired.
The most uninsured state in the country, and also won't allow the Medicaid expansion. Go ahead.
Right. And they are having a hearing on a piece of legislation that would require the posting of the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom in the state, and not just posting it on a framed piece of paper so large with font so big that you can see it from any corner of the room, even if you have bad eyesight. Like even if your eyesight is shitty, we're going to make sure it's big enough so you can see all of it, including the part about not coveting your neighbor's wife or ox or ass or whatever it is they don't want you to covet in the King James Version of the Bible. We're going to make sure that every kid can see that. I cannot wait until they have to explain what it means to covet the neighbor's ass, particularly in a school where you're not allowed to talk about ass coveting, apparently, at all in any way, shape, or form. It's going to be a bit of a contradiction for them. But the point being, they have this hearing and there is a woman testifying. There is a woman testifying who says we need to restore a biblical standard to our schools.
A bill in the Texas legislature would require public schools to display the 10 Commandments in each classroom.
Right.
Texas and other states have made numerous previous attempts to enshrine the 10 Commandments in schools, but recent rulings from conservative Supreme Court indicate their efforts could be closer to fruition.
My guess is that the court won't allow it. But here's the thing. The fact that they're having a hearing on it, the fact that this woman is saying openly, yes, we need to restore a biblical standard. But the great irony is she then explains her kids don't even go to public school. They're homeschooled, of course, because she needs to have them at home where she can make sure that they learn that people rode on the backs of dinosaurs. And they're not going to learn that in a science class because, that's bullshit. But you can teach it to them around the kitchen table. You can teach them that the earth is 10,000 years old and Noah really did live to be 947 years old or whatever the hell it is. You can teach them all manner of bullshit. But she wants to make sure that your kids and my kids and whoever else's kids in Texas, right? She wants to make sure that they're all subjected to her bullshit. Not just that her kids are subjected to it, but that everyone else is. And so she wants the 10 Commandments to be posted, even though, as I point out, some of those 10 Commandments, I mean, they tried to make it sound like it was just about honoring your father or mother, but the 10 Commandments have several that are clearly ecclesiastical, right? That have nothing to do with just nice advice, like be nice to people, don't kill, don't steal. It's like, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But which Sabbath? We all don't have the same Sabbath. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Well, what is that? That's a religious admonition that really only, essentially makes sense if you feel that defaming the Lord is a thing because you presumably believe in a God. All the things that are the first 3 or 4 commandments have nothing to do with these general admonitions about being a good person. And even the one, as I point out, that I've always just sort of tripped me up, the one about honoring your father and mother, I always find it interesting that people want you to follow the 10 Commandments, because if you're an evangelical Christian, you're actually asking me, as someone who was raised Jewish, to dishonor my father and mother. My father and mother raised me Jewish, decided that was going to be my both religious background and cultural background. So what you're basically saying that I have to do to go to heaven is to tell my parents to fuck off. Like, you guys are going to hell. Sorry about you, but I'm not going with you. And so you're saying I actually have to actively violate one of the commandments in order to get to heaven. But you don't notice the contradiction. You don't think about the contradiction, just like you don't think about any of the other contradictions in your faith. And you want to teach all of us the same thing and force us to internalize it. So it isn't about liberty. No one is trying to keep this woman from homeschooling her kids. I want to mock her. Yes. I want to make fun of her. Yes.
Now, she can have a 10 Commandments shower curtain. She could have them written on the bathtub floor. She could put anything she wants in her homeschool.
Anything she wants to do. That's fine. And what I think the point about mocking her, this is what the religious right, I think, is really misinterpreting as oppression, right? If you have been, and we've talked about this with race before, if you have been able to take your hegemony for granted forever, right? You have been able to be the dominant, you run everything, like you make the rules. And so for years, Christians in America, that was who they were, right? Nobody really pushed back on them. Nobody really challenged them. It was sort of this unspoken thing that if you were Jewish or if you were atheist or agnostic or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu or whatever you were, you just sort of kept to yourself. You didn't really challenge the king, right? The dominant group. And now we're in a much more pluralistic place where we have the opportunity to challenge and to push back and to be like, wait a minute, that thing you said doesn't make sense. And I think you've got these folks who've never, ever been questioned or challenged, who, when questioned and challenged, think that that's oppression. Because if you're used to hegemony, pluralism feels like oppression. It feels like they're coming for your rights. No, we're just challenging your views. The way that you apparently have always challenged ours and never thought anything of it. Because every time you told us we were going to hell, you were challenging our views.
Well, not only that, not even allowing you to have your views heard or allowing you to hear your own views. So it's not about necessarily about challenging your views. It's, you can have yours, but don't take mine, or don't prevent me from having mine. By the way, the number one commandment number one is, you shall have no other gods before me, Tim.
Right. No other gods before me.
How dare you?
Right. I mean, that is a sectarian approach toward the idea of spirituality. It isn't about just good life advice. If it were just, and by the way, like, if you think the 10 Commandments, because the reason this is being introduced is at least ostensibly to reduce the likelihood of violence in schools. Okay. Ever since there have been schools, there have been the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were in place long before the whole idea of the modern school was there. So every shooting that has taken place in a school, everybody that ever got stuffed in a locker at a school, anyone that got beat up on the playground at a school, they all heard about the 10 Commandments. They all knew about the 10 Commandments. It's not like someone was like, hey, that kid you're beating up, you probably should read the Bible. What's the Bible? Never heard of the Bible. They've all heard of the Bible. They mostly went to church. They mostly know the 10 Commandments, for God's sake. They know they're not supposed to do it. They did it anyway. And if you let them have a gun, they're going to do it much more easily. It isn't a lack of religiosity that is causing this. There are lots of countries on this planet far less religious, certainly less Christian than us, and they don't have anywhere near the level of violence, particularly gun violence, that we have. What is the common denominator in all of this? There are two things, right? There's men overwhelmingly, and it's guns. Well, there are men everywhere, right? And they don't necessarily have the same level of violence. So then it must be the guns. This is just sort of process of elimination. Yeah. It's just social science. It's just, it's regression analysis. It's not real hard to do, but the right doesn't want to do any of it.
You write in this piece, in other words, these are people who want others to follow rules they don't even believe in, or which, if they were genuinely followed, like the one about honoring parents, would require the rejection of Christianity by anyone raised as anything else. That's the point you made about yourself. But then you say, but evangelicals never think about any of that. They ignore the contradictions that riddle their Bible and the hypocrisy that marks their daily lives, or they write it all up as man's sinfulness and use it as more proof of our fallenness and need to be saved by the grace of God because the hypocrisy is evidence of our inadequacy. See? The circular logic never stops, but that is why we must stop them, you say. And stopping them is stopping them from being elected into power or being elected into power and then appointing more Christian nationalists as federal or Supreme Court justices.
Right. I mean, it's perfectly fine for Christians to be elected to office, but once you are in office as a Christian, if the only rationale that you can give for whatever legislation you're pushing is one that is rooted in your religiosity, then it's not legitimate because that is a violation of other people's. Now, if you've got a good, like, for instance, the idea about not murdering, a person might push back on what I'm saying and say, well, wait a minute. Should we not have laws against murder just because that's in the 10 Commandments? No, of course not, because there are perfectly secular reasons to not allow murder, right? There are perfectly secular reasons to not allow theft, to not allow some of the other stuff that is prohibited in the 10 Commandments. Some of that stuff you don't need religion to know not to do, right? But the other stuff that is purely religious has nothing to do with that. And if the argument you have, for instance, against abortion ultimately has to do with the radical innocence of the unborn, and you get that idea from scripture, and you get that idea of when personhood begins from some scripture that you can quote, I knew you and formed you in the womb, said God, or whatever the phraseology is, right? If that's your argument, that's fine for you. If that's why you want to believe life begins at the point of conception, that's fine. You have every right to that belief. But if you're going to seek to impose a law based on a belief that is fundamentally rooted in religiosity, not in science, not in some deep philosophical understanding of personhood, which is a very complicated notion. It isn't as simple as, human life. Human life is a scientific thing. And I don't know anyone that denies that embryonic life is human or fetal human life is human life. The question is it personhood? Personhood is a concept that has been discussed and debated by philosophers, discussed and debated by theologians. If your only argument is theological, then you were governing from a place that I do not think in a secular society is valid. If you can come up with a solid philosophical argument that's free from that, then okay, then we can talk. Otherwise, you are trying to impose theocratic principles on the rest of us, even if we don't share those ideas.
And of course, the point gets made all day, every day. And if you are going to believe that, then keep believing that once the baby's born about its life.
Right. Of course. Which they don't, because they don't want to expand the healthcare programs that young children need. They don't want to provide the opportunities for young people, whether it's mental health care, physical health care, emotional health care, education itself. They don't want to do any of that. These are people who fetishize the embryonic life. They fetishize fetal life for reasons that are principally religious. And again, for them, that's fine. But when you try to make secular law on that basis, it's not fine. Right. The same is true if you decide you're going to go after drag shows because God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve who thinks Eve's Steve. Like, that is not an argument, right? If that's your argument, God made us this way. We're just men and women. That's not, like, you can believe that. You can preach that at your church. You can teach the children that in your youth group at church, at whatever. But like when you're trying to make laws based on what you think God said, maybe it's just me, but I don't think God needs the Speaker of the Tennessee House to be his little messenger boy. I don't think God actually needs people the likes of, Ted Cruz to be his little messenger boy or whoever. I don't think that God needed Pat Robertson to bring the good news to the people. Like, if God really wants us to know that drag is bad, God could sort of let us know without having to go through these third-rate intermediaries that apparently have anointed themselves, right? And so what you have is people whose principal arguments for these things are rooted in their sectarian theological principles. And although those are fine for their home, the idea that they have a right to govern on that basis for the rest of us is simply against everything that this country has or should stand for, and certainly what we claim to stand for. We are supposed to be a pluralistic nation, and we should govern as one.
Which brings us to Bud Light.
Yeah.
I'm just catching up with this one. I hadn't really followed it, but apparently Bud Light, they partnered with a guy named Dylan Mulvaney, and Dylan Mulvaney is a TikTok star, and
Right. She's a trans. Yeah, she's right. She's trans.
She's a trans TikTok star and very popular. Basically, I guess Bud Light came out in support of trans people.
They did one ad with Dylan.
Well, as somebody said, I read this somewhere else, but it's like, not without a tremendous amount of focus grouping. Like they didn't do this because it's the right thing. Like any giant company, they did it because they thought they'd make more money than they would lose. I'm sure they knew there might be right. I mean, let's not.
That. I mean, they have actually all but admitted. Look, they know that Bud Light is sort of not the hippest beer brand, particularly for younger people, maybe, and they even admitted like they want to sort of get out of the image of being like the frat boy beer that you just drink.
Oh, they put her on a can.
It was on a can. Well, they had a commercial with Dylan where she was holding the can. I think it had a picture of her, whatever. It was like I think it was a one-off ad. It's not even like a major campaign, but, and they may have done it for very cynical reasons, but for whatever reason they did it, good for them. They did it. And then, Kid Rock got in his feelings about that, and decided to shoot Bud Light with an AR-15 because, Bud Light is hard to take down with a Sig Sauer. But Bud Light is hard to take down with a Beretta or a revolver. You can't take down Bud Light with a baseball.
I'm watching it now.
Semi-automatic. Yeah, it's something. He went out to the lake.
Grandpa's feeling a little frisky
and he took
today.
a couple cases of Bud Light, and then he decided he'd post on Instagram as he shot it. I should point out he missed some of it, which I don't know how you miss Bud Light with an AR-15. It seems very difficult to miss.
Well, it's moving. I mean, they're being hard. He threw it up in the air, didn't he? Oh, no.
No, he sat it on a table.
Oh, I got to watch this shit.
He sat it on a table, shot at it, and a lot of it is just still sitting there even after he is.
Oh, I watched some guy throw one up. That's why I thought, but he used a shotgun.
So. Kid Rock had a stationary case of Bud Light, shot it, and a lot of it didn't even get hit. Wow. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Ridiculous. All right. Well, we can move past that because I want to get you before I leave, before you have to go. I wanted to ask you about, I don't think you've written anything recently about Clarence Thomas, but certainly you've been talking about it on social media. And as well as Ben Shapiro, who apparently is giving him a pass for hanging out with a billionaire who collects Nazi memorabilia. What do you want to say about Clarence Thomas that you haven't said? Well, say whatever you've said about Clarence Thomas on social media. Your reaction to this and him hanging out with a guy that collects Nazi memorabilia, and Ben Shapiro, your Jewish brother, defending that guy.
Well, putting aside the Nazi piece for a second, I mean, just the fact that this individual is on the highest court of the land and thinks it was perfectly okay to accept all of these unreported gifts, free trips, etc., from this mega donor is just extraordinary. I mean, I knew Clarence Thomas didn't understand the law, but this really proves that he didn't understand the law. Yale needs to ask for its law degree back. And in a just world, Clarence Thomas would be bounced from the Supreme Court. Sadly, of course, we don't live in a just world. We live in a world where the right reveres this individual. There's absolutely no way he's going to be removed, at least in the current political environment, in spite of breaking the laws in this way, in spite of violating the laws in this way, in spite of all the corruption that he and his wife both have been involved in surrounding the insurrection and J6 and all of the stuff that his wife does, which, he says, we don't talk about things. Come on. No one believes any of this. It's perfectly fine for your wife to be a political activist, but when you're on the highest court in the land, you need to demonstrate propriety. You need to not even have a whiff of impropriety. And this is why, among other reasons, that the Supreme Court is held in such low regard right now because of these kinds of things. Now, as for Harlan Crow himself, yes, this idea that this individual who collects apparently dictator statues, because who doesn't want a good dictator statue in their backyard as an art installation, and not just dictator statues, but also Hitler memorabilia, not just memorabilia, artwork by Hitler, right? Like paintings by Hitler, a signed copy of Mein Kampf. I understand why you might have a copy of Mein Kampf. I understand that. Like, that's a historical relic, right? That's a historical work of bullshit. And you might have that in your library. I have, for instance, in my library behind me, David Duke's autobiography is on this shelf. But you know what? I didn't get him to sign it. I didn't send it to him and be like, David, hook me up. I really would love your signature for posterity. And I wouldn't have paid for a signed copy, which is what I'm assuming Harlan Crow did for the Hitler copy of Mein Kampf. What does that say? You don't get, I have a signed copy of James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain and also The Fire Next Time, because I really revere James Baldwin as a writer. I have a menu from an Italian restaurant in New York City from 1951 with Joe DiMaggio's signature on it, because my grandfather met Joe DiMaggio or something in New York and got into stuff. That's cool, because that's like an interesting piece of history. And Joe DiMaggio was not, to my knowledge, an overly objectionable character that at least I know of. Hitler's different, right? And Hitler's like in a different Hitler's in a kind of category, so much so that family name does not exist anymore. That is the difference category that Hitler is in. In fact, people don't even name their children Adolf anymore.
This is making me feel like somewhere in between about my Jeffrey Dahmer signed fridge.
Right. I know, right? Right. It's or like your Ted Bundy signed VW Bug.
I mean, he only killed like a dozen people.
Right. And so he has all the Hitlers. He's got linens from Hitler's house, like linens, that you could, I guess, like wring the DNA out of if you got them wet or something. I don't know what the hell this is, but the fact that Ben Shapiro, America's #1 Orthodox super Jew, which as a Reform Jew, I'm able to say, and it's not offensive, but if you say it, it would be terribly offensive. So please don't. But Ben Shapiro says, well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? This is what you do for things that you hate, which means Ben Shapiro, by that estimation, must have a huge collection of Palestinian literature in his house, because we know what he hates. Right. He's got the Palestinian flag. He's got like Yasser Arafat's underwear from 1973. He's clearly, because he's making, this is what happens to the MAGA cult. This is what happens when you were so beholden to people that you cannot critique any of them. And you say things like that in this high-pitched squeal that only dogs can hear. I mean, the register that I just used is still several octaves below anything Ben has been able to produce since he was about 11 and his voice stopped changing. He is saying to the world, it's okay if this guy has Hitler memorabilia. I mean, who doesn't? What's the big deal? This is how you remember what you hate. Why do you need a reminder that you hate Nazis? Why? Why do you need to be reminded? Like, you go into your study and you go, oh shit, there's the Hitler signed Mein Kampf.
Well, I mean, it's the reason. It is the reason I have Timothy McVeigh's brush. But listen, to each their own. I like to have reminders of what I hate, which is why I have statues of Confederate soldiers on my lawn as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Little tiny ones, though, not large ones. Yeah, it's so. Clarence Thomas.
I mean, Clarence Thomas is a joke. He's all, and he's very upset, by the way, about this ProPublica report that was on his Coca-Cola can. I just wanted to
I saw that tweet too.
Very upset.
Yes.
Very upset about
he can't
that.
believe they brought.
You only get if you're of a certain age. Like, that joke does not work for anyone who's like under about 45, I think.
No, I liked it a lot.
You can Google it, kids. You can Google it.
All right, Tim. Awesome. Read his stuff at Medium. Follow him on Twitter for more, obviously. Always appreciate it when we get to talk to you. And love the Ben Shapiro impression. Good stuff. Very good stuff. That's really shocking that that's coming out of your face.
Right.
Thank you very much, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And there he goes, Tim Wise. How about that Ben Shapiro impression? I wasn't expecting that. Hilarious. Awesome. As always, go check him out on Medium and follow him on Twitter and learn more about him in the show notes, and every guest in the show notes. That's the notes about the show. And you can click on that when you go listen to the show, in case you don't know. Everybody says it. They also say go give him 5 stars and write a review. I'm no exception. That makes a big difference. Everybody knows that. So please go do it for Stand Up right now. And if you haven't subscribed, I need your subscription badly. Please sign up now. Patreon.com/PeteDominic. All right, that's it. That's all. I look forward to seeing you guys Thursday night. That's tomorrow night on the Hangout. I'll be in the woods if you need me. It's a Wednesday morning. I'm walking in the woods with my dog and my friend. I hope you are too, or something similar. And now, an inspiring quote to end today's show. Yesterday I was so clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today, I'm wise, so I am changing myself. Rumi. Talk to you tomorrow, friends.
You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's offer your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience. Well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.